This is a true story, something that happened to me in the autumn of my life. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I did, and I would do it again. The whole ugly affair started in a courtroom, a place I thought was reserved for truth, with the weight of a single, beautiful mahogany gavel hanging in the air. It was that gavel, poised in the judge's hand at the Charleston County Courthouse, that was about to shatter my life, but it was the whisper from the man who'd just won, the smug, venomous hiss in my ear as he passed me, that set my revenge in motion. He leaned in close, his cologne a sickeningly sweet cloud of victory, and said, "Sentiment doesn't hold up against a signed affidavit, Mr. Pendleton. Especially one you can get a desperate man to sign. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." My world didn't just shrink in that moment, it collapsed into a singularity of grief and rage. The case was about a piece of land, a half-acre plot of earth tucked away behind our old house in the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood of Charleston. To the city, it was Parcel 7B. To me, it was Eleanor's garden. My late wife, Eleanor, had spent the last decade of her life transforming that forgotten patch of weeds and rubble into a sanctuary. It was a riot of climbing roses, heirloom tomatoes, and fragrant herbs, with winding stone paths she'd laid herself and a small, withered bench under a sprawling live oak where we would sit for hours. It was more than a garden, it was the living testament of her love, her patience, her very soul pressed into the soil. After she passed from the cancer that stole her light far too soon, that garden was all I had left of her. It was where I went to talk to her, to feel her presence in the warm sun and the hum of the bees she'd so lovingly cultivated. Then came the developer, a slick corporation from Atlanta with a portfolio of soulless glass and steel condominiums. They owned the surrounding lots and wanted Parcel 7B to complete their footprint. They offered me an obscene amount of money, enough to live out my remaining years in lavish comfort. I refused. I explained, with all the civility I could muster, that the land was not for sale at any price. It was a memorial, a community treasure she had opened to the neighborhood kids, a sacred space. They didn't care. They saw a stubborn old man standing in the way of profit. So, they sued, claiming a long-dormant covenant gave them the right of first refusal and that a clerical error on the deed invalidated Eleanor's claim. The fight was on, and they brought out their biggest gun, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was everything I despised. He was in his mid-40s, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, and a reputation for being the most ruthless litigator in the Lowcountry. He wore suits that cost more than my first car and carried himself with an air of unshakable, smug superiority. In the courtroom, he was a viper, twisting my words, painting me as a sentimental old fool clinging to the past, while his client represented progress, jobs, and the future of Charleston. My lawyer, a kind but ultimately outmatched man named David, did his best, but Thorne was a different species. He moved through the legal system not as a servant of justice, but as its master. He knew every loophole, every pressure point. The turning point of the case, the fulcrum on which my entire life was broken, was the affidavit. It was from a man named George Gable, a groundskeeper who had helped Eleanor in the garden's early days. He'd moved away years ago, and we'd lost touch. Thorne's team had apparently found him. His signed statement swore that he'd overheard Eleanor talking about her plans to one day sell the land, that she saw it as an investment and would have been thrilled by the developer's offer. It was a lie. A monstrous, soul-crushing lie. Eleanor would have sooner sold her own heart. I told David it was a fabrication, that Gable would never say such a thing. But there it was, in black and white, his signature on the bottom. It was enough to poison the well, to plant the seed of doubt that my claim was based on emotion, not fact. Thorne wielded that document like a cudgel, battering my credibility until there was nothing left. The judge, a woman who seemed more weary than wise, sided with the developer. The gavel fell. Eleanor's garden was gone. And then came that whisper from Thorne, the casual admission of his crime, delivered with the breezy confidence of a man who knew he was utterly untouchable. He hadn't just defeated me, he had gloated about the rod at the heart of his victory. He had confirmed that he'd preyed on a desperate man to desecrate the memory of my wife. As I stood there, paralyzed in the echoing silence of the courtroom, watching his tailored suit disappear down the marble hallway. A cold, hard resolve began to crystallize in my chest, replacing the shattered pieces of my heart. He thought he had won. He thought it was over. But I was a retired history professor. I knew that the most devastating wars aren't won with a single, noisy battle, but with a long, patient, and meticulously planned campaign. He had closed a chapter of my life, and in doing so, had unwittingly made his own life the sole subject of my final, and most important, research project. I left the courthouse not as a victim, but as a historian, and the history I was about to write was his ruin. My car seemed to drive itself home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were bone white. I walked into the empty house, the silence a physical weight. On the mantel was my favorite picture of Eleanor, taken in the garden. She was laughing, dirt smudged on her cheek, holding up a ridiculously oversized zucchini like a trophy. Her eyes, full of life and light. I stared at that photo for what felt like an hour, the lawyer's words replaying in my mind, a desperate man to sign. Desperate. That was the key. George Gable had been a good man, kind and hard-working. What could have made him so desperate that he would betray Eleanor's memory? That whisper wasn't just a boast, it was a loose thread. And I was going to pull on it until his entire world unraveled. The days that followed the verdict were a gray, formless fog of grief. I'd wake up and for a blissful second, forget. Then the weight of it would crash down on me, the courtroom, the gavel, the ghost of Eleanor's garden. The first sign of the end came a week later. A bulldozer, yellow and monstrous, rumbled onto the property. I watched from my kitchen window as it tore into the earth, ripping up the rose bushes she'd babied for years, crushing the stone paths under its treads. Each churn of the machine felt like a physical violation, an excavation of my own heart. They were erasing her. Within an hour, a decade of love and labor was reduced to a mound of dirt and splintered wood. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the destruction was burned into my mind. I walked into my study, the room where I'd spent 30 years grading papers and writing lectures on the fall of empires. It was a room dedicated to the past, to understanding how great and powerful things come to an end. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I began to search. I wasn't looking for legal loopholes or avenues for an appeal. David had already told me that was a dead end. I was looking for a man. George Gable. Thorne's whisper had given me a starting point. Desperate. What kind of desperation? Financial? Medical? I was a historian. My currency was information, my tools were patience and meticulous research. I started with public records, old employment files I'd kept, social security databases. It took me 3 days of chasing down digital breadcrumbs, dead ends, and false leads. Finally, I found him. Not in some sunny retirement community in Florida, but in a state-funded nursing facility an hour outside of Charleston, a place called Oak Creek Assisted Living. The name sounded pleasant, the online reviews told a different story. Understaffed, depressing, smells of bleach and despair. The next morning, I drove out there. The facility lived down to its reputation. It was a squat, brick building with peeling paint and windows that seemed filmed over with a layer of grime. The air inside was thick with the scent of antiseptic and overcooked cabbage. I found George Gable in a shared room, a frail, withered version of the robust man I remembered. He was propped up in a hospital bed, staring blankly at a game show blaring on a small television. An oxygen tube snaked under his nose. His desperation was palpable. It was medical. He looked up as I approached, and a flicker of recognition, followed immediately by fear, crossed his face. "Mr. Pendleton," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "What are you doing here?" I pulled a chair up to his bedside. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I spoke softly, as a friend. I told him about the verdict, about what had happened to the garden. I watched his eyes, and I saw a deep, profound shame. "They said you signed a paper, George," I said quietly. "A paper that said Eleanor wanted to sell." He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at his gnarled hands, knotted together on the thin blanket. They helped me, he whispered, his voice cracking. My lungs, the treatments. I couldn't afford them. My son, he has his own family to worry about. And there it was. The hook. The leverage. Marcus Thorne hadn't found a witness, he had manufactured one. He had found a good man at his weakest, drowning in medical debt and fear, and thrown him a lifeline with a poison pill attached. A young woman came to see me, George continued, the words tumbling out now, a confession he'd been desperate to make. From the lawyer's office. Nice girl. Said they heard about my situation. Said her boss was a philanthropist, wanted to help folks in the community. They set up a fund, paid for everything. All I had to do was sign some papers for their charitable foundation's records. Did you read what you signed, George? I asked, my voice still gentle, though my heart was pounding with cold fury. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with tears. It was a stack of them. My hands shake so bad. I can't read the fine print anymore. She pointed, I signed. She said it was just a formality for their accounting. I never would have said that about Eleanor. She loved the garden more than anything. It was her heaven on earth. He was telling the truth. I could see it, feel it. Thorne hadn't just lied, he'd orchestrated a cruel piece of theater, preying on a sick old man's vulnerability to steal a dead woman's legacy. He hadn't just bent the law, he had broken a man's spirit. But George gave me more than just confirmation. He gave me a name. I remember her name tag, he said, his brow furrowing in concentration. Pretty girl. Looked too young to be mixed up in something like this. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. That was the second thread. Sarah Jenkins. The paralegal. The nice girl who delivered the poisoned bargain. Before I left, I made George a promise. I told him I wasn't angry with him, and that I would find a way to make things right. As I walked out of that depressing facility and back into the sunlight, the fog of grief had finally burned away, replaced by the clarifying fire of purpose. Thorne thought he was untouchable. He operated from a gleaming office tower on Broad Street, surrounded by a phalanx of partners and associates. He schmoozed with judges at the Mills House Bar and played golf with state senators at Kiowa Island. He was a pillar of the Charleston legal community. But pillars can crumble. All you have to do is find the cracks in the foundation. He had used a paralegal to do his dirty work. People who do dirty work for powerful men are often either fiercely loyal or deeply resentful. Given that George described her as a nice girl, my bet was on the latter. She was a potential crack. I drove straight from the nursing home not toward my house, but toward the Charleston County Public Library. The hunt for Sarah Jenkins had begun. Thorne had built his victory on a foundation of lies, and I was going to excavate every single one until the whole rotten structure came crashing down on his head. He had underestimated me. He saw a grieving old history professor. He had no idea that a historian knows better than anyone how to dig up a body. Finding Sarah Jenkins proved more difficult than finding George. She was no longer listed on the website for Thorne's firm, Thorne, Covington, and Finch. It was a behemoth, one of those old-money Charleston institutions whose name was etched onto brass plaques all over the city. A quick search of professional networking sites showed she had worked there for 2 years as a paralegal before leaving abruptly about 6 months ago. There was no glowing farewell post, no announcement of a new, better position. She had simply vanished from the legal world. This was another clue. In a profession as insular as Charleston's legal community, people don't just disappear. They move to another firm, go into government work, or leave the state. Her digital silence was deafening. It suggested she hadn't left on good terms. I spent another week using my research skills to piece together her life. University records, voter registration, social media profiles that had been dormant for months. I eventually found her, not in another law office, but working as a shift manager at a Starbucks in Mount Pleasant, just over the Ravenel Bridge. The fall from a prestigious Broad Street law firm to serving coffee was a steep one. It spoke of desperation, perhaps even exile. I knew I couldn't just walk in and confront her. I would be the ghost of a case she was undoubtedly forced to forget, a case that likely led to her professional demise. I needed to be careful. For 2 days, I just watched. I sat in my car across the street, nursing a thermos of coffee, observing the morning rush. I saw her. She was just as George had described, young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes that now looked perpetually tired. She moved with a weary efficiency, forcing a polite smile for customers, but her shoulders were slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with her job. She was trapped. On the 3rd day, I went in. I didn't order from her. I waited until her break, when she went to sit at one of the small outdoor tables with a paperback novel and a cup of her own. I approached slowly, so as not to startle her. "Miss Jenkins?" I asked gently. Her head snapped up. Her eyes widened with the same mixture of recognition and fear I'd seen in George Gable's. She remembered my face from the courthouse. "Can I help you?" she stammered, already starting to gather her things. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. "I was the defendant in the Parcel 7B case. I just want to talk for a few minutes. That's all." "I can't," she said, shaking her head, not meeting my eye. "I'm not supposed to talk about my work at the firm. I signed an NDA. I'm not here to cause you trouble," I assured her. "I think you were put in a terrible position." I spoke to George Gable. At the mention of his name, all the color drained from her face. She sank back into her chair. The fight went out of her. I sat down opposite her, leaving a respectful distance between us. "He told me you were a nice girl," I said. "He told me you helped him." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I swear, I didn't know what he was going to do with that paper. Mr. Thorne just told me we were helping an old man with his medical bills through the firm's pro bono fund. He said he needed a signature to authorize the payments. I thought I was doing a good deed." She believed it because she wanted to. Because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. "And when did you realize it wasn't a good deed?" I pressed, still gently. "During the trial," she said, her voice dropping lower. "When he submitted it as an affidavit. I saw the discovery documents. I saw what he'd written above Mr. Gable's signature. I confronted him. I told him it was wrong, that it was perjury and fraud." "What did he do?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "He smiled. That's the worst part. He smiled that smug smile of his and told me I was a brilliant paralegal for noticing the discrepancy, but that my job was to file paperwork, not question strategy. He said my loyalty was to the firm, not to some sad old man. He reminded me of my student loans, of the non-disclosure agreement I had signed. He said if I ever breathed a word of it to anyone, he'd make sure I was not only disbarred before I ever even took the bar exam, but that he'd personally see to it I never worked in this city again, not even as a janitor." This was Thorne's power. It wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in the web of influence and intimidation he wove through the city. He didn't just win cases, he destroyed lives, silencing dissent with threats and financial ruin. 2 days later, I was fired, Sarah continued, wiping her eyes. For performance issues. He had my emails monitored, my phone records checked. He built a case against me to discredit me before I could even think of becoming a whistleblower. Everyone in town heard I was unreliable. No other firm would even interview me. This was the only job I could get. We sat in silence for a moment, the cheerful bustle of the coffee shop a world away. I had found my crack in the foundation, and it was a fissure of righteous anger and shattered dreams. I had expected to find an accomplice. Instead, I had found another victim. It was in that moment, seeing the wreckage Thorne had made of this young woman's life, that my resolve hardened from a plan into an obsession. This was no longer just about a garden. It was about justice. While I was processing this, I saw it. Across the street, a sleek, black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the curb in front of a new, upscale office building. Marcus Thorne stepped out. He was laughing, shaking hands with some other man in an expensive suit. A large banner was being unfurled on the building's facade, "The Future of Lowcountry Law, Thorne, Covington and Finch, Mount Pleasant Office Grand Opening." He was expanding his empire. I followed Sarah's gaze to the scene. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She watched him preening for the cameras, a conquering king surveying his new territory. This was the villain's power in its most arrogant form, flaunting his success, built on the ruins of people like her, like George, like me, for the entire world to see. I felt a surge of cold fury. I leaned forward. "He can't be allowed to get away with this," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with steel. "He thinks he's untouchable. But he's not." Sarah looked from Thorne back to me, her eyes searching my face. She saw not a grieving old man, but a fellow traveler in the land of the wronged. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm a historian," I said, a slow, grim smile touching my lips for the first time in months. "I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to research. I'm going to document. And then, I am going to publish." I looked back at Thorne, who was now cutting a large red ribbon with a pair of oversized golden scissors, basking in the applause. He looked invincible. He was at the apex of his power, admired, wealthy, and respected. It was the perfect time to begin his demolition. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclamation. I was going to give Sarah her career back, George his dignity, and Eleanor her peace. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder, placing it on the table between us. "Tell me everything, Sarah," I said. "Tell me about every corner he cut, every rule he bent, every secret he has. Let's start building our case. Not for the courtroom. For posterity." She looked at the recorder, then at me, and a spark of the fire I suspected she once had returned to her eyes. She nodded slowly, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Sarah talked for 2 hours. The story she painted was of a man drunk on his own power, a legal sociopath who viewed the law not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a set of tools to be manipulated for his own gain. The Gable affidavit wasn't an anomaly, it was his modus operandi. He specialized in finding the leverage point of every person he encountered, greed, fear, shame, and pressing down until they broke. But she gave me more than just anecdotes, she gave me actionable intelligence. She told me about Thorne's obsession with his public image. He was meticulously crafting a narrative of himself as a brilliant lawyer and civic leader because he had a singular ambition, a federal judgeship. He was networking, fundraising, and greasing palms, building a political machine to ensure his nomination when the next vacancy arose. His reputation was everything. It was his armor. And that, I realized, was his greatest vulnerability. You don't fight a man in armor by striking the plates, you find the gaps at the joints. "He has a fixer," Sarah said, lowering her voice even further, though no one was near. "A guy named Ray Collins. Ex-cop, now a private investigator. Whenever there's something messy that needs to be handled off the books, Thorne uses Ray. Bribing a minor zoning official, convincing a witness to change their story, finding dirt on opposing counsel. Ray is the one who makes the problem go away." This was the missing link. Men like Thorne never get their own hands dirty. Ray Collins was the instrument of his corruption. "How do they communicate?" I asked. "Never by email or phone. Not directly. Thorne is paranoid about a paper trail. But I saw him do it once. He uses an online chess forum. An old, obscure one. They have an ongoing game, and they leave notes in the comment section of their moves. It looks like chess notation and analysis, but it's a code." My heart quickened. This was it. This was the back door. It was sloppy, arrogant. He thought no one would ever be smart enough to look there, let alone decipher it. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, leaning in. "His biggest case right now. The one that's making him millions. It's a huge commercial real estate deal down on Kiowa Island. Osprey Point. It's a massive resort development, but it's mired in environmental challenges and lawsuits from local Gullah Geechee families who claim ancestral land rights. Thorne represents the developer. He told his partners it's a slam dunk. But I know for a fact the developer's environmental impact report is fraudulent, and at least one of the Gullah family's key witnesses suddenly withdrew his testimony. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't go to the state bar. Thorne would bury me in motions and discredit Sarah with her NDA. I couldn't go to the press, not yet. I had no hard proof, only the word of a fired paralegal and a sick old man. I had to get the proof myself. I had to bait the trap. And Osprey Point was the bait. I thanked Sarah profusely. I gave her my personal number and an old burner phone, telling her to call me if she remembered anything else. I also gave her $5,000 in cash. "What's this for?" she asked, her eyes wide. "For your time," I said. "And for your courage. Find a better job. Get out of here. And get ready to be a witness when the time comes." She hesitated, then tipped the envelope, a look of stunned gratitude on her face. As I left, I felt like a general plotting a campaign. I had my target, I had my inside source, and now I had my battlefield, a chess forum and a luxury resort development. My first call was to my grandnephew, Liam. He was a brilliant kid, a computer science major at Georgia Tech who could make code sing. He owed me for paying for his last 2 semesters of tuition. I'd always told him it was a gift, but now I was calling in the favor. I met him for lunch the next day at a quiet diner in Savannah. I laid out the whole story, leaving nothing out. I expected skepticism, maybe a lecture about the dangers of vigilantism. Instead, his eyes lit up with a rebellious fire. He hated bullies, and Marcus Thorne was the textbook definition of one. "So you want me to crack a code on a chess forum and digitally surveil one of the most powerful lawyers in South Carolina?" he asked, a grin spreading across his face. "Uncle Art, this is the coolest thing anyone has ever asked me to do." For the next month, Liam and I became spies. He set up a secure, untraceable network in my study. We spent hours poring over the chess forum Sarah had identified. It was exactly as she described. 2 users, White Knight 82, Thorne, we assumed, and Castle Rock, Ray Collins, had a game that had been going on for over a year. The comments on each move were cryptic. NF3, Bishop's defense looks weak. Recommend pressure on the queen's side. Or rook to E4. The package is ready for delivery at the usual spot. Confirm receipt. Liam, a chess player himself, quickly saw the pattern. The moves on the board were nonsensical, a jumble of illogical plays. The real game was in the comments. "It's a substitution cipher," he explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The chess notation refers to a keyword. It's brilliant in its simplicity." It took him another week to crack it. The key was the case number of a landmark South Carolina legal precedent. Arrogant and poetic in a sick way. Once we had the key, the messages opened up to us like a book. It was a ledger of Thorne's sins. Payoffs to zoning board members. Instructions for witness intimidation. Plans to plant evidence. We were watching his criminal conspiracy unfold in real time. We focused on everything related to Osprey Point. We learned that Thorne, through Ray Collins, was about to make a final, large payment to a supposed community leader to silence the remaining Gullah families who were fighting the development. The payment was for $50,000, and it was scheduled to happen in 2 weeks. This was our chance. We had to intercept. We had to get him on tape. But we couldn't just record the payoff. We had to become part of the transaction. I used a significant portion of my retirement savings, the money I'd been offered for Eleanor's garden, and funneled it through a series of shell corporations Liam helped me set up, ending in a newly formed LLC, Pendleton Heritage Group. I then hired a private investigator of my own, a grizzled, cynical ex-FBI agent from Jacksonville who specialized in corporate espionage and had no love for slick lawyers. His name was Decker. I met with Decker and laid out a plan that was audacious, dangerous, and bordered on illegal. His only response was a slow grin. "I'm in," he said. "I hate guys like this, Thorne." The plan was this: Decker, posing as a representative for my shell company, would approach the very same community leader Thorne was planning to bribe. But he would offer more. He would offer $100,000, not as a bribe to be silent, but as a donation to their legal defense fund, with the promise of more to come from a sympathetic anonymous benefactor. The goal was to make the man refuse Thorne's dirty money, forcing Thorne and his fixer to get desperate. We would then leak information back to Thorne that a rival group was trying to fund his opposition, panicking him. A panicked man makes mistakes. He gets sloppy. He takes risks. I was creating a problem that Thorne couldn't solve with his usual, quiet methods. I was forcing him out into the open. The night before Decker was scheduled to make his move, Liam and I were monitoring the chess forum. A new message from White Knight 82 appeared. QH5. An unexpected player has entered the game from the flank. The target is wavering. I need you to close this. Whatever it takes. This cannot fail. Castlerock replied an hour later. B8. Understood. Applying direct pressure. The king will be in checkmate by week's end. The trap was set. The pieces were moving. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. For the first time, I felt a sliver of something other than grief or anger. It was the thrill of the hunt. Thorne thought he was the king on the board, but he was nothing more than a pawn in a game I now controlled. Decker was a master of his craft. He met with the community leader, a proud and principled man named Moses Washington, and played his part to perfection. He presented himself as a weary businessman who had been screwed over by the same developers Thorne represented in a past deal and was looking for a little payback. He made the offer of the legal defense fund. Moses, whose group was on the verge of financial collapse, was wary but listened. Decker didn't press. He simply left a cashier's check for $50,000 on the table as a good faith first installment and a burner phone, telling him to call when he was ready to accept the rest. No strings attached, Decker had said. Just make sure the developer doesn't pave over your ancestors' graves. 2 days later, as we'd hoped, Ray Collins, Thorne's fixer, showed up to make his own offer. Moses, now bolstered by our anonymous funds, did exactly what we gambled he would. He told Collins to take his blood money and get off his property. The rejection sent a shockwave through Thorne's operation. We saw it on the chess forum that night. The messages from White Knight 82 were frantic, angry. He was being squeezed. His clients were getting nervous, the Osprey Point deal was on the verge of collapse, and his slam dunk was turning into a quagmire. He was losing control, and powerful men like Thorne cannot abide losing control. He instructed Collins to find out who was backing Moses Washington. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. We had to lead them to a new target, us. But we couldn't make it easy. It had to feel like a discovery, a victory for them. Liam created a false digital trail. He built a legend for a fictitious Florida-based real estate investor, a man named Richard Steele, who was supposedly the money behind my shell corporation. He created social media profiles, a bare-bones website for a fake company, and even backdated a few blog posts about sustainable development. Then, he intentionally left a single, subtle vulnerability, a weakly encrypted email server. It was a digital mousetrap, baited with the cheese of a rival investor. It took Collins less than 48 hours to find it and break in. He was good, but Liam was better. Liam let him see exactly what we wanted him to see, emails between Richard Steele and his lawyers discussing a plan to countersue the Osprey Point developers, tying them up in court for years and potentially exposing their fraudulent environmental reports. It was a fabrication designed to light a fire under Thorne. And it worked perfectly. The next message on the chess forum was chilling. Coup 2. The Florida problem, Steele, needs a permanent solution. He's meeting with his local council next week. I need you to get me leverage. Something big. Something that takes him off the board entirely. They were going to come after me, or rather, the fictional persona I had created. It was time for the sting. Decker, a man of many talents, was a convincing Richard Steele. He was 50 pounds heavier than me, with a booming voice and a fake Texan accent, the picture of a brash, wealthy developer. We booked a suite at the Dewberry, one of Charleston's most exclusive hotels, under Steele's name. We let it be known through a few carefully placed calls by Decker to local real estate agents that Mr. Steele was in town to meet with his attorneys. We knew Collins would have the hotel under surveillance. The suite was our stage. Liam, a master of gadgetry, swept it for bugs and then installed our own. Microcameras hidden in the smoke detector and the television, microphones in the lamps. We would see and hear everything. Liam would be monitoring from a van parked a block away, recording it all to a secure server. My role was simple, yet terrifying. I had to be in that room. I couldn't be Richard Steele, but Decker needed a wingman, his supposed financial advisor. I dyed my hair a dusty gray blonde, wore thick-rimmed glasses without a prescription, and put on a suit that was 2 sizes too big. I looked like a completely different person, a nebbish accountant, easily overlooked. The plan was for Collins to approach Decker, as Steele, with a threat or a bribe. We needed to get him on tape, explicitly connecting the offer to Marcus Thorne and the Osprey Point case. The night of the meeting arrived. A storm was rolling in off the Atlantic, the sky a bruised purple. The air in the hotel suite was thick with anticipation. Decker was calmly sipping a bourbon, looking for all the world like a man without a care. I, on the other hand, felt my 69-year-old heart hammering against my ribs. This was no longer an intellectual exercise in research and strategy. This was real. We were provoking a dangerous man. There was a knock on the door. Not from the hallway, but the connecting door to the adjacent suite. They had booked the room next to ours. Clever. A way to avoid being seen on the hallway cameras. Decker gave me a quick nod. "Showtime," he murmured. He opened the door, and Ray Collins stepped in. He was a block of a man, with a shaved head, dead eyes, and an aura of casual menace. He wasn't there to negotiate. "Mr. Steele," Collins said, his voice a low gravelly rumble. "You're making a mistake getting involved in business that doesn't concern you." Decker laughed, a big, booming sound. "I'm a capitalist, my friend. Everything concerns me if there's $1 to be made. Or in your client's case, $1 to be lost." Collins's eyes narrowed. He took a step further into the room, his gaze sweeping over me for a second before dismissing me as irrelevant. "My employer, Mr. Thorne, is prepared to be very generous to make this problem go away. He'll buy out your interest. $500,000. All you have to do is pack your bags and forget you ever heard the name Osprey Point." This was it. He'd said the name. He'd connected it to Thorne. 500,000? Decker scoffed. "That's an insult. The lawsuit I'm about to file will cost your boy Thorne 10 times that in reputational damage alone, especially when the press finds out his clients faked their environmental studies. That's not a good look for a man who wants to be a federal judge, is it?" Collins's expression darkened. The pretense of a negotiation was over. He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope, tossing it onto the coffee table. "All right, playtime's over," he snarled. "That's not an offer. That's your life. Photos of your wife picking up your grandkids from school in Dallas. Your home address. Your private banking information. You walk away from this, or they start getting hurt. Mr. Thorne doesn't like loose ends." My blood ran cold. He had the wrong man, but the threat was real. This was the monster Thorne kept on a leash. Decker, to his credit, didn't even flinch. He picked up the envelope, glanced inside, and then started to laugh again, a chilling, humorless sound. "You really are a stupid son of a bitch," Decker said, his Texas accent gone, his voice now flat and cold. "You and your boss." Collins looked confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" Decker looked from Collins to me. He nodded toward the hidden camera in the television. I'm talking about him, Decker said. Wave hello to the State Bar Ethics Committee, Ray. And the U.S. Attorney's Office. You just threatened a retired federal agent and confessed to conspiracy, bribery, and witness tampering on behalf of your boss, Marcus Thorne, who is, by the way, a candidate for the federal bench. Collins's face went from confusion to panic to pure rage in a split second. He lunged, not at Decker, but at the television, trying to rip the camera out. But Decker was faster. He moved with a speed that defied his age and size, intercepting Collins and putting him in a submission hold that brought the bigger man to his knees, gasping. The door burst open and two of Decker's own men, former colleagues he'd hired as backup, rushed in. It was over in 30 seconds. As they were cuffing and sputtering, cursing Ray Collins, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. Got it all. Crystal clear audio and video. It's a masterpiece. I looked at the pathetic, defeated man on the floor. He was just a tool. The man I wanted was still out there, safe in his corner office, thinking he was invulnerable. But we now had the weapon that would shatter his world. We had the truth, on tape. The chess game was over. It was time to knock over the board. We had him. We had Marcus Thorne cold. The recording from the hotel room was a prosecutor's dream. Ray Collins, on camera, explicitly naming Thorne, admitting to a conspiracy, and making direct threats, all while trying to bribe a man he believed was interfering in the Osprey Point case. It was the linchpin, the irrefutable piece of evidence that connected all the others, George Gable's videotaped testimony, which I had gone back and recorded, Sarah Jenkins' sworn affidavit, which she was now eager to provide, and the mountain of decoded messages from the chess forum, which Liam had compiled into a damning chronological log of criminal activity. We had the whole rotten enterprise, from the petty cruelty of the Gable affidavit to the high-level conspiracy of the Osprey Point deal. The question was no longer about guilt. It was about presentation. I could have simply handed the file over to the U.S. attorney. Thorne would have been indicted, probably convicted. He would have been disbarred and sent to a country club prison for a few years. But for me, that wasn't enough. A quiet, clinical legal proceeding wouldn't suffice. Thorne had humiliated me publicly, in a courtroom filled with my peers. He had built his entire career on a carefully constructed public facade of brilliance and integrity. I didn't just want to defeat him, I wanted to demolish that facade. I wanted him to experience the same public evisceration he had inflicted on me and so many others. I wanted the world to see the monster behind the $1,000 suit. And I knew the perfect stage for the final act. I did some research and discovered that Thorne's exploratory committee for his judicial nomination was hosting a major fundraising gala. It was in 2 weeks, at the Charleston Gallard Center, the city's most prestigious performance hall. The guest list was a who's who of South Carolina's legal and political elite. Senators, congressmen, judges, and the managing partners of every major law firm would be there. It was to be his coronation, the unofficial launch of his campaign for the federal bench. It would, instead, be his execution. The plan required precision timing. My new team, me, the aging historian, Liam, the digital ghost, Decker, the grizzled warrior, and Sarah, the redeemed whistleblower, began to prepare. Liam packaged our evidence into a slick, professional digital press kit, complete with video files, documents, and a concise summary of Thorne's crimes. We compiled a master email list, every major news outlet in the Southeast, every member of the State Bar's disciplinary committee, every lawyer at Thorne's firm, and, most importantly, every single person on the gala's guest list. We were going to airdrop a bomb, and there would be no collateral damage, only a direct hit on the target. 2 days before the gala, I sent a single, anonymous email to Thorne's personal address. It was from a disposable account, routed through a dozen overseas servers. There was no text. Just 2 attachments. The first was a still image from the hotel surveillance video, showing Ray Collins's face contorted in a snarl as he made his threat. The second was a short audio clip of his voice saying, "Mr. Thorne doesn't like loose ends." I wanted him to stew. I wanted him to spend the next 48 hours in a cold sweat, wondering who had him, what they knew, and when the axe would fall. I wanted him to walk onto that stage not with the confidence of a king, but with the terror of a man on the gallows. The night of the gala was electric. The Gallard Center was glittering, a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. I wasn't on the guest list, of course. I bought a ticket for a symphony performance that was happening in the smaller concert hall in the same building. Dressed in my best, albeit dated, suit, I blended in with the other patrons. I found a spot in the main lobby, near the entrance to the grand ballroom, where I could watch the attendees arrive. I saw them all, the judges who had praised Thorne's legal mind, the partners who had profited from his corruption, the politicians who saw him as a useful ally. They were all smiles, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. Thorne himself was the picture of success, but I could see the cracks. His smile was a fraction too tight. His eyes darted around the room a little too quickly. He was looking for the ghost. He was looking for me. I had coordinated with a journalist, a young, hungry investigative reporter from the Post and Courier named Jessica Riley. I had vetted her for weeks. She had a reputation for being fearless and thorough. I had given Decker the task of approaching her, feeding her the story of a lifetime on the condition that she hold it until she received our signal. The signal would be the mass email. At exactly 8:15 p.m., as Thorne was scheduled to take the stage for his keynote address, Liam, stationed in his van nearby, would hit send. I stood in the back of the ballroom, behind the last row of tables, partially obscured by a marble column. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. An old, respected retired judge gave a glowing introduction, calling Thorne a titan of the bar and the future of the American judiciary. Then, Thorne walked to the podium to thunderous applause. He looked out at the sea of adoring faces, his confidence seeming to return under the warm spotlights. He began his speech, his voice smooth and commanding, filled with platitudes about justice, integrity, and the rule of law. It was sickening. At 8:15, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A simple text from Liam, sent. The digital bomb had been deployed. Hundreds of smartphones in that room suddenly lit up with notifications. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. People were looking at their phones, their eyes widening, their faces shifting from adoration to confusion, then to shock. Thorne, blinded by the stage lights, hadn't noticed yet. He was in the middle of a story about his deep respect for the Constitution. It was then that Jessica Riley, the reporter, stood up from her table near the front. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through his speech. "Jessica Riley, from the Post and Courier. Could you comment on the allegations of bribery and witness tampering in the Osprey Point development case, as detailed in an evidence package we just received?" Thorne froze. The blood drained from his face. He looked out at the audience and saw not a crowd of supporters, but a gallery of accusing eyes, all looking up from the screens of their phones, where they were watching the video of Ray Collins threatening a man's family on his behalf. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Thorne's ragged breathing into the microphone. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His carefully constructed world, his ambition, his reputation, it all evaporated in that single, silent, humiliating moment. He was naked, exposed for the fraud he was in front of everyone whose respect he had craved. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I didn't need to. My work was done. As the chaos began to erupt, with people standing up, shouting questions, and his own partners backing away from him as if he were radioactive, I simply turned and walked out. I slipped out of the Gallard Center and into the cool Charleston night. The storm had passed, and the air was clean. I had given him the public execution he deserved. He wasn't just defeated, he was erased. The aftermath was a quiet inferno. The story was on the front page of every newspaper and the lead on every local news broadcast for a week. Marcus Thorne was a supernova of scandal. The U.S. Attorney's Office unsealed an indictment within days. The state bar summarily suspended his license. His firm, in a desperate act of self-preservation, scrubbed his name from their letterhead overnight, issuing a statement professing their shock and horror. His partners, the same men who had patted him on the back at the gala, were the first to cooperate with the authorities, eager to save their own skins. His judicial ambitions were not just dead, they were a public joke. Ray Collins, facing a mountain of federal charges, flipped on his former boss immediately, corroborating every piece of evidence we had. Thorne was arrested not in his gleaming office, but at his multi-million-dollar home on Sullivan's Island, a perp walk for the evening news. He had built an empire of intimidation and lies, and it had crumbled to dust in a single night. There were other, quieter victories. Sarah Jenkins was inundated with job offers from firms eager to hire the brave whistleblower who had helped bring down Marcus Thorne. The last I heard, she had accepted a position at a respected civil rights law firm in Atlanta and was finally studying for the bar exam. She sent me a simple text message, "Thank you. You gave me my life back." The Osprey Point development was halted indefinitely pending multiple investigations into its fraudulent permits and environmental reports. Moses Washington and the Gullah families now had a fighting chance to save their ancestral lands, armed with a significant legal defense fund, courtesy of the Pendleton Heritage Group, which was quietly dissolved. As for George Gable, I used some of the remaining funds to move him to a private, high-quality care facility where he could live out his remaining days in comfort and dignity. The cloud of shame had lifted from him. He knew he had helped right a terrible wrong. And then there was Parcel 7B, Eleanor's Garden. With the developer's primary legal counsel under federal indictment and their case built on proven fraud, they quickly sought to settle the maelstrom of legal trouble they now faced. They not only returned the deed to me, free and clear, but they also paid a substantial settlement for the damages, both physical and emotional. The money meant nothing to me, but the land meant everything. I spent the rest of that fall and the following spring rebuilding. I hired a landscape architect to help me restore the garden exactly as Eleanor had designed it, using her old photographs and journals as a guide. I laid the stone paths again with my own hands, my joints aching, but my spirit resolute. I planted the climbing roses, the fragrant herbs, the heirloom tomatoes. Neighborhood kids, hearing the story, started volunteering to help. It became a community project once more, just as she had always intended. Today, I am sitting on the same weathered bench under the sprawling live oak where Eleanor and I used to sit. The garden is alive again, buzzing with bees and vibrant with color. It is peaceful. The world sees the garden restored, the villain punished, the good guys victorious. They see a tidy story with a happy ending. But it's never that simple. The battle against Marcus Thorne changed me. To catch a monster, I had to think like one. I had to be ruthless, manipulative, and cold. I had to use deception and intimidation, the very tools he favored. I had won, but I knew that I had wielded a dark and terrible power to do so. The law had failed me, so I had become my own law. I had sought justice, and I had achieved a brutal, satisfying vengeance. I look at my hands, stained with the good, rich soil of Eleanor's garden. They are the same hands that set the trap, that pulled the strings, that orchestrated a man's complete and utter destruction. He had taken my past, so I took his future, and the silence that followed was the only verdict that mattered. The end.